IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. History has become a battleground between those who want to change it and rewrite it, though selectively, and those who say our history has been well researched and is fine as it is. The latest target is the Mopla Rebellion of 1921 in Kerala, which has been so far seen as a revolt of the peasantry against the British colonial government. The BJP now disagrees, actually the RSS, and calls the Moplas an early example of a Taliban mindset. That may have something to do with the fact that the Moplas are Muslim. But these are strong words and have offended many in Kerala as well as established historians. Manu Pillai, author and historian, joins us today to explain why Ram Madhav, who holds a prominent position in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, has brought this up suddenly. Pillai has written very well-regarded books like The Ivory Throne about the Travancore royal families and The Rebel Sultans about the rulers of southern kingdoms. Manu Pillai, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Siddharth. Pleasure to be here.
Firstly, please tell us about the Moplas and the rebellion of 1921. First, we need to know who the Moplas are and for our listeners elsewhere. And of course, what the rebellion was all about.
You know, the very term Mopla, or what Majalis call Mapla, we now associate broadly with Muslims in Malabar, but in reality, it was used also for Christians. So if you go into South Kerala, it's actually a term that's used for Christians there. As a community, they're pretty old in Kerala. Their oral history tells us that in the Prophet's lifetime itself, there was a Muslim community that emerged in Kerala. The oldest mosque in Kodungalur is supposed to have been constructed a year or two before the Prophet died. Of course, the current structure isn't that old, so we can't really verify the claim. But by the 9th century, by the mid-9th century, 849 to be exact, you find names like Ibrahim and Ismail, etc., and Arabic signatures in a royal grant given by a Kerala king. So obviously, in order to witness a royal grant like that, this was a community by the 9th century of some influence and importance in Kerala. You find this influence growing because, as the Zamorins of Calicut come into power on the coast in Calicut, they establish this huge trading city there. Their chief allies are the Arabs. They are the ones who sort of form a coalition with the Zamorin. They're the ones driving in the trade. The Zamorin offers very good terms of trade. There are wonderful stories about the Zamorin's honesty and this and that. But it's always featuring a Mopla or an Arab trader or a Yemeni trader. There are all kinds of stories like that. In fact, one of the founding political legends of Kerala is the story of a king called Cheraman Perumal who converts to Islam and goes abroad to Mecca because he witnesses or he hears of, depending on which version you've heard, he hears of the Prophet splitting the moon and then he's completely fascinated and ends up going to Mecca and dies there. So there is, even in the oldest political legend in Kerala, the presence of the Muslim. And these stories are a way also for the Muslim community in Kerala to become part of the pre-existing cultural ecosystem there. So there's a legend called Parai Petta Pandirakulam, which is about a sage called Vararuchi and his Paraya caste wife, who have a series of children. One of them is a Brahmin, one of them is a carpenter, one of them is a girl whose descendants are Nayars, and one of them is also a Muslim. So many legends that come from the Malabar region do incorporate the Muslim quite, almost naturally into the landscape, into the cultural landscape. What happens is that by 1921, of course, you have the Khilafat movement that's happening because of something global. First World War, the Ottoman Empire's on its last legs, the Caliph is removed. And of course, the Muslims of North India, basically, who sort of recognize him as the Caliph of Islam, they set off the Khilafat movement. And you see that coming into Malabar as well. But the rebellion that took place under the Moplas or the Maplas in 1921 also has a local prehistory. Khilafat in some ways offered an excuse for a large-scale demonstration of discontent, which of course, as we all know, took a violent turn. But that violence also has a history in the sense that from a position of prominence, from a position where they controlled trade, the coming of the Portuguese and the bringing by the Portuguese of certain ideas of memories of the Crusades, this animosity towards Muslims, meant that in the centuries that followed, the Maplas were increasingly, let's say, they received the short end of the stick. They were increasingly pushed out of trade. They were prevented from trading in certain commodities. There are stories that talk of violence against the Maplas. And of course, the Maplas reciprocate. By the 16th century, you have Sheikh Zainuddin's Tufati Mujahideen, which is about jihad, but it's not against, when he refers to infidels, it's not Indians and Hindus, he's referring to the Portuguese. So there is this building up of a kind of militarization in the Mapla community because of the stress applied by the Portuguese. What happens is that by the end of the 18th century, the Maplas are they're highly impoverished. Although there is one Muslim royal family in Kerala, they are a highly impoverished community. And the reason being that as the Portuguese and various European colonial powers became more and more important, the local Hindu rulers started to do business with them. They had no option. And as a result of which, they also sidelined the Maplas. Tipu Sultan's invasion of Malabar seems to have given a brief sort of glimmer of hope to the community, because Tipu tended perhaps to bring about policies, etc., that favored them. A lot of Hindu landlords had fled Malabar, so a lot of Maplas were able to take control of land. But the coming of the British East India Company after their victory over Tipu meant that by the dawn of the 19th century, once again, the Maplas had been pushed back, the Hindu landlords were back. And through the 19th century, you find records of dozens of what are called Mopla outrages. These, it could be a single individual doing these, it could be as many as 100. The victims were largely upper caste people, but also Dalit Hindus. I think a couple of them were British officials. So the division is that certain scholars feel that the trigger is purely economic. Others, as you know, you mentioned Ram Madhav, who suggests that, it was purely religion that guided all these events, culminating in 1921. In reality, as is the case with most things, it's a mix of both, which is that there were economic triggers. This was an economically marginalized community. Colonial laws that favored landlords over tenants meant that landlords could get away with demanding as much as 77% of the produce from their Mapla tenants. So they were disenfranchised not only economically, but because there was a kind of division where the peasantry, especially in South Malabar, was largely Muslim, whereas the landlords were also largely Hindu, Brahmins and Nayars. This economic issue also could easily be communalized. It also quickly acquired a religious sort of color because there was a clear division in terms of who was the peasant and who was the master. Now, religion did influence what was happening, because you do find towards the middle of the 19th century, a series of clerics who were influenced by various things happening abroad in Arabia and so on. And they did sort of set about a very orthodox reading of things in Malabar as well. So all these Mapla outrages of the 19th century, there was a ritualized element to it. People did go out to become martyrs. These were suicide missions, and they were very aware of it. You have the dozen odd who survived in those 100 years, the very many incidents of those 100 years. They did say that their worst fear was that they would be shot in the leg and they would survive, because their hope was to die and go to heaven. So there was that kind of religious fervor that was visible in the Mapla outrages. But we can't negate the economic either. It is the economic that in some ways fuels the religious. The economic issues offer the original trigger. Religion and ideology offers a justification to do something about it in a highly violent way. And that's what you see in these smaller outrages. In 1921, this really happens at a much bigger scale. We're talking about, I think by the end of it, almost 40,000 people surrendered. Some over 2,000 people were killed. I'm talking about Maplas only. These are fighters and rebels. And they did have a whole section of Malabar under their political control. Again, statements like Mr. Ram Madhav sort of suggest that this was some kind of highly coordinated rebellion. As we know, even the 1857 rebellion against the British was a very chaotic affair. If you read studies, you'll find that even in a city like Delhi, in a single city like Delhi, the rebels had no single leader. There was lots of internal turmoil. There were lots of internal divisions. And you see that among the Maplas also. Firstly, there are higher caste Maplas, there are lower caste Maplas, depending on which community they might have converted from. There are Maplas who were not forcefully converting Hindus, for example, but there were other leaders who were. There were Maplas who had certain tracts under their control, while other groups controlled certain other tracts. So the British are always referring to the rebellion as a matter of gangs. There are different gangs in control of different parts of Malabar. So any reading, and these are all political readings that we see in the press, any reading that tries to sort of give you a very compact, a very clear idea and a very like simplistic idea of what the rebellion was all about, there's a fundamental problem there, because then that's not a historical statement, that is more a political statement. If you're talking about a historical statement, it's a mix of economics, religion, and a long history going back several centuries.
No. So this actually brings me to my next point. My next question is, it depends on how it is seen and for what purpose. So keeping then, I presume, not in all this complexity, but a fairly compact kind of explanation in history books in Kerala must be there. But even if it isn't, or even if it is, this is some kind of a accepted view and a settled view that because the Maplas are very much integrated with the Keralites of other religions. But to suddenly bring this up with such force, because he has said that this is a Talibani mindset, but with such force, cannot be just a stray statement. No, it's got some kind of objective. Why do you think they have brought it up?
Well, obviously, I think given what's happening with the Taliban, given that it's in the news, it's become a very convenient thing to sort of raise in India. It helps people become more and more paranoid. I don't think anybody intelligent will now doubt that in the last few years there has been an increased sort of cornering of Muslims in the country. You tend to see anybody who sees the news, even if it is pro-regime or pro-dispensation news channels, etc. The very fact that they're defensive about it does suggest that there is something going on there, something that is deeply uncomfortable. We're seeing videos. Of course, in the pre-BJP era also, there were instances like this, but not with the kind of impunity perhaps that we see now. So, of course, there is a broader political climate. On top of that, because there's all this news about the violence in Afghanistan, people fleeing, this is in the news, using a term like, the Talibani mindset and so on, that is meant clearly to appeal to certain people. It's meant to send out a political message. So again, this is just that usual politics of a lower level that we've been seeing. It's not really anything to do with history or anything to do with a deeper understanding of what happened. I would only add, however, that the reason people can get away with this, the reason people can even attempt to do something like this is perhaps because we haven't studied the religious side of the Malabar or the Mapla incident as much as we ought to have, which opens up a window for people to exaggerate it, to sort of turn it into the stick with which to beat people today and to sort of exploit it for all kinds of political purposes. Whereas if we do understand the incident and all its shades, all its elements, the economic, the religious, the historical, all of that together, people will also understand things better, and it will be, let's say, a little more difficult when it comes to using these things for short-term political goals. But yeah, it's a disappointing statement. I don't, of course, politicians make such statements. Especially these days, there's a leave of absence that basic rules of politics and ground rules have taken, which is sad, but to that extent, it's not surprising. But statements like that are not taken seriously by anybody who actually knows the subject.
Yeah, but that may be few and far between, Manu. In the way you've explained it, how will it appeal to the RSS constituency, small that it is, and Hindus in general, who may not be part of the RSS but may get quite affected by this? Will that happen?
I think, it depends on where and, which set of people you're talking about. For example, in Kerala, there is increasingly on social media, there's a loud set of people who do sort of promote this kind of language. But, in my interactions with college students, and I've spoken at several colleges, etc., in the past in Kerala, and these are in tier 2 towns, etc., there isn't that much ground appeal for this kind of messaging. So, because this Taliban thing is happening, because obviously, people have found ISIS connections in Kerala, and there have been cases of Keralites going abroad, etc. I think the whole idea is to use this to give this argument some more power in Kerala. As far as I can see, it isn't working in Kerala. Kerala is the kind of place that does push back against this, partly because a lot of the younger generation is also pretty well read. People are quite vocal about their political opinions. And there is a huge newspaper culture. There's a lot of debate that takes place in Kerala because of that. And the press isn't completely servile, as you see on TV in other parts of India, especially in Hindi and English. So there's that much going for Kerala. Of course, to the wider constituency across the country, a lot of them already believe half these things to begin with. So this is just a confirmation of biases that already exist. And, this is like one more, you're hitting the nail with one more hammer and trying to drive in the message. I think any means to really resist it or fight it will necessarily need to shed more clarity on the topic, will need to call out the kind of rubbish that's peddled in the name of religion and politics now and in the name of history today. And, we just have to really pull up our socks and say that this is not true. This is simply not accurate. Now, the people who believe these things instinctively because they're sold on a certain ideology, they may perhaps continue to believe it. But I think as far as historians and writers, etc., are concerned, there is a responsibility to speak more about the incident as it happened, as we know it happened, and in all its complexity. And then, I think in the long run, perhaps people will come around, even if in the short term things look a bit dire and quite tragic.
But we have to take note of the fact that as you hinted, that the BJP has been doing very, very poorly in Kerala. It had very, very disappointing results in the last elections. So this kind of hammering may start making a dent.
Yeah, but I'm not too optimistic because attempts in this direction have been made in the past. I think they'll have to come up with a different strategy. We saw the kind of mass mobilization that took place around Sabarimala, but I don't think the BJP candidate even in that area won. So it's just not very easy to use religion in Kerala. Yes, there is some truth in the fact that people are slowly moving towards that mindset. When I go, to my ancestral place, which is in rural Kerala, I have extended relations who will vote Congress, but only because they think the BJP has no chance of winning. And you do find in conversations a certain tilt is growing towards the BJP. In local elections, etc., they have started making a mark. So this is obviously a step in the ladder. This is obviously intended perhaps as a step in the ladder. But all I'm going to say is it's not easy. It's not going to be a simple case of where you put out something like this and people will swallow it and start believing something. That is not all that easy in the Kerala that I know and I've experienced. So I'm not completely pessimistic. I'd rather be cautious but not pessimistic.
So we've got to see this in the context of a larger strategy to rework and maybe rewrite history, one that glorifies Hindus and demonizes Muslims, such as trying to destroy Tipu Sultan's legacy or suggesting that Rana Pratap actually won in Haldighati against Akbar's army. There may be other instances also. So it's part of this larger push to constantly valorize the Hindu and demonize the Muslims. Don't you think?
It is, but that's also a political thing, right? I think that's why I always draw this distinction. This is entirely political, which is why I think even when history is presented this way, even if you explain to proponents of this particular line of thought that why they're wrong, or you explain and have a decent conversation, it doesn't really work because the intention isn't really about getting down to the scholarly truth of the matter or to argue on scholarly terms, etc. It really is, as you suggested, a political plan of some sort. But of course, as I said, different people respond in different ways. There may be political parties that stand up to it. There'll be scholars and writers who will criticize that kind of reading of history and that oversimplification of history. You mentioned Tipu Sultan, for example. There's a scholar called Caleb Simmons who wrote a book called Devotional Sovereignty. And it's actually quite fascinating because we often, this is something all generations do. We view these past figures from our contemporary limits and prejudices and our filters, without realizing that, in that time, it wasn't a democracy. There were no human rights, things like that. Tipu Sultan was a king, and kings often did very many contradictory things, regardless of whether they were Hindu or Muslim. In Tipu's case, Caleb Simmons makes this point about how even as he's invading Malabar and calling it, using jihadist language and destroying temples, etc. in Malabar, the same Tipu Sultan's also sending Shivalingas to Sringeri Matha to be installed there with clear instructions on what pujas need to be done for his great glory and for his successes in battle. So on the one side, he's criticizing, in quotes, infidels, and he's sort of waging war against infidels. On the other side, he's also sending, again, in quotes, infidel gods to be worshipped and done puja to. So clearly, kings did these contradictory things. You have to read that in context. Of course, it wasn't pleasant for the people in Malabar who were attacked and whose temples were pulled down, etc. I remember going to the ancestral home of the early modern, late medieval mathematician Sangramagrama Madhava. and his descendants in their family temple have two Dwarapalakas. The arms were cut off, they say, by Tipu Sultan's army as it was marching down that region. And, it was interesting because obviously this was a prominent Brahmin family there. The soldiers went in and cut off the arms because the family had fled. But I also remember a conversation with Jaya Jaitley, whose ancestors were the Rajas of Kolangod. And she told me that in their ancestral temple, there's some kind of a pidham or a platform on which the deity is installed, which was actually donated by Tipu Sultan's people, because their ancestor seems to have bent the knee early on. So Tipu Sultan not only spared him, but sent some kind of a gift to the Kolangod Raja. I mean, this is not to say he was good or bad. I mean, that's not the point. A historian doesn't try to make this good or bad kind of a point. You just try to understand the historical figure in their time, in their context, and with all the layers that are involved. When it comes to politics, obviously politicians like to read things in a different way. There are political ideologies that need to be catered to across the board, which means that there is an oversimplification across the board. Everybody tends to fall into this trap. Scholars will complain and sort of bewail this, but as I said, it's not going to go away anytime soon. So all we can do is try and communicate good research to a reading audience, try and talk more about it, have podcasts like this, bring out the conversation to a larger audience so that the larger audience is also invested in history, as a more serious discipline than merely a football or a shuttlecock with which politics and politicians can play their games. As I said, it's a long-term battle, frankly, and one shouldn't be dissuaded by short-term trends and short-term statements that are made like this. These statements have happened. Increasingly, they are happening. They do get eyeballs, but the only way to draw eyeballs away from them is to generally, let's say, educate a larger audience.
We'll be right back after this short break.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. Our papers in Kerala have large circulations and very, very loyal readers. It's one of those places where newspapers still command a lot of respect. Are they writing about this and giving their platform to people who show that it is a little bit of a fraudulent political argument?
Oh yes, in fact, not just the papers, even in the news. My grandmother watches the Malayalam news, and every evening when I go to see her, I get a little bit of that as well. There's a lot of debate going on about this. Of course, some of the debate can also get pretty frivolous. There are people actually debating whether we should call them freedom fighters, whether we should call them something else. This obsession with labels, of course, it's very powerful. People, labels have political value. Labels have meaning. People draw meaning from labels. But again, that seems pretty short-term to me. But yes, in general, people are talking about it. And that's why I said earlier, it's not easy in Kerala to push a message like this to the people, and people won't swallow it like that. There is a certain kind of mentality to think twice. People don't immediately just fall into something like this. Of course, as they say, death by 1,000 cuts. So instead of one big swoop, you make 1,000 cuts and then hope that it'll have some kind of an impact. There may be some of that also. But as I said, I'm not pessimistic. I think Kerala still has the resources to show that this kind of thing won't work in polarizing society there. And we see that. Even in the last elections, we saw that. And I have a feeling that in future elections also, we'll see it. But again, we need to be cautious because it's not, as I said, I'm not pessimistic, but I'm cautious.
Yeah, well, certainly you can't be complacent because the pushback has to come. But during your Rebel Sultans is really fascinating in the sense that it showed that every Sultan king had people of the other religion in their army or in their administration. It was a far more complex arrangement than we try to show that, there is only one ideology, one religion, and it's out to finish the others. But this Tipu Sultan, campaign against Tipu Sultan with the BJP in Karnataka, which is a little more widespread and powerful. They are running the government at the moment in Karnataka than in the other southern states. Do you find that it has had an impact among those who didn't know and have started leaning in the one direction that Tipu Sultan was actually a very nasty communalist?
Yes, in fact, you get. I mean, sometimes people send me samples of these WhatsApp forwards that go around, including some very foolish ones. There's one, for example, that has a photograph of some gentleman from Africa, and they say that, oh, this was how Tipu Sultan looked, and he's supposed to, again, look ugly or something. That's the point of that WhatsApp forward.
Yeah.
Whereas, look at us, we've been taught that Tipu Sultan was this good-looking man in an oil painting. Anybody with half a brain would know that Tipu Sultan died long before the camera was anywhere near him. There was no question of him being photographed. Decades before that was ever a possibility. I've received even a kind of, I can't call it a book, but a very long PDF that somebody wrote about Tipu's cruelties, etc. But, that's the thing. Once something becomes a political football, it's politicians. You see some of it on social media. How much of it penetrates the ground is still debatable because, to a certain extent, we're living in a very small world. As I said, when I meet college students, etc., they're not gullible like that. They're not idiots. These are not kids who are unreasonable. You explain a point to them, even if they come with some kind of a preconceived notion, at the end of an event, at the end of a talk or a seminar or something where you've spoken to them, they do open up. It's not as though they go back completely resistant to ideas, etc. There is a willingness among most students and most young kids to actually, reassess certain beliefs of their own. And I think the same can be told of Tipu Sultan as well. The problem partly is that we still don't have a pretty, good accessible book on him written by somebody who's decent. And I think that's a little bit of a problem because you only have these two versions. You refer to the Deccan Sultans and, people employing people from the other religion, etc. Frankly, the problem is we haven't done enough research on kingship as a concept in India, because what you find is we often think that kings, when they articulated their kingship, did tend to fall back on religious ideals. So if you're a Hindu king, you fall back on these old classical ideas, whether you're a Shivaji, whether you're a Vijayanagara emperor, whether you're Martanda Varma in Travancore, etc. But that doesn't mean all your politics is conducted through a religious prism. Now, Martanda Varma of Travancore, styled himself Padmanabha Dasa, donated his territories to the deity, and brought in lots of Brahmins around him, instituted new ceremonies and festivals. On the face of it, very Brahminical, very Hindu, his kingship was articulated in a very strongly Hindu way in the 18th century. But his politics involved, a mercenary from a Dutch East India Company mercenary who then a prisoner of war who was then made commander of his army. It included East India Company weapons. It included Marava mercenaries from Tamil Nadu. It included importing a Brahmin bureaucracy from Tamil Nadu. It included destroying a lot of the previous again, Hindu elements that existed in Kerala, including old families, attacking certain temples, which people don't talk about. There were a lot of other things that happened. Kings, it's just like today's politicians. You may have an ideology or you may have certain ideas which you put down on paper and then officially you believe that. But then when you're actually doing an election, when you're actually negotiating politics on the ground, there are lots of concessions you make. There's a lot of compromise. There's a lot of other factors that come in. And for some reason, we don't extend that to kings in the past. We assume that if this is what they wrote or this is what they said, then that must be true. Whereas everything we see is the opposite. With Chhatrapati Shivaji, for example, when he crowned himself king of the Marathas in 1674, he also used a highly Hindu, religionized sort of vocabulary to articulate his kingship. So he's Vishnu reborn on earth to rid the earth of the Mlechas being Islamic powers. Of course, he's employing Qazis, he's employing Muslims. He's referring to Islamic power or kingship that is articulated in an Islamic language in India. At the same time, when what people refer to as syncretic culture in India, his own father Shahaji, his own uncle Sharifji, they were named after a Muslim Sufi called Shah Sharif. You go to Rajputana, you'll find Rajputs who articulate their kingship in a religious vocabulary, and yet you'll also find Rajputs like the Shekhawats who are named after, I think, Sheikh Burhan, basically a Sufi sheikh. And because that man blessed a Rajput prince and he had children, all their descendants were thereafter called Shekhawats. So, both things exist simultaneously. So historians know how to negotiate this. But I think often in the general debate, especially on social media, etc., we fall into the trap of, say, reading something, reading a record and taking it at face value without bringing in the oral history, the material history, the architecture, the other sources that exist. together, which can give us a picture of how politics was in those days, as opposed to just a bookish reading based on the official ideology of a certain king. So even Tipu, when he frames his kingship, it would be in an Islamic vocabulary, but that doesn't mean he was some kind of hardcore Islamist. His right hand man was a Brahmin called Purnaya, his finance minister. So much so that after the British toppled Tipu Sultan and they were wondering what to do with Mysore, and they decided to give it to the Wadiyars, the Hindu royal family, Purnaya actually said no. Give it to Tipu Sultan's son. This is Purnaya's Brahmin minister advocating for Tipu Sultan's family, as opposed to the so-called more legitimate Wadiyars who had ruled before. So obviously there is something that is much more complex than is visible on the surface. It's just, people have to, I suppose, read more, and historians have to communicate better so that people understand these things and don't necessarily believe everything that comes out on social media and comes out of the mouths of political figures.
Well, the last statement you made was what was playing on my mind while you were giving this answer. Is the counter to, let's say, politician statement or WhatsApp forward is, of course, easy to read, easy to access, easy to find books on these matters, these kings, which give a wider this, because your book is a tome. A lot of people may find it too difficult, complex reading, and a shorter book, which is easy to understand, also in different languages. For example, Govind Pansare, who wrote a wonderful book on who was Shivaji, gives an entirely different perspective and respects his egalitarianism, but gives an entirely different perspective, which angered some fundamentalists. So that kind of thing, and it's a slim book, paperback, very, very reasonably priced. And I'm afraid that has been one of the big failures, because in the sense there's no one to blame for it, but those books are not easily found.
Yeah, but again, I think that's changing. More and more people are trying to make history more accessible. I've said this in other places also. In the West, it's quite common for academics to also write accessible books. My favorite example is Mary Beard. She's a very senior scholar, but she also writes, readable, very interesting, fast-paced books, like SPQR, for example, for general audiences who are not trained historians or students. That's also picking up in India slowly. Scholars are starting to write accessible books. Rudarangshu Mukherjee's recently written one on Rani Lakshmibai and the other female protagonist of the 1857 rebellion, the Begum of Awadh. People are doing that. Even mine, my first book was 700 pages, but it sold tens of thousands of copies. So I'm not at all pessimistic about it. I don't think history needs to be dumbed down in any way or oversimplified. I think if you make it just slightly more accessible, make an effort to sort of entice your reader and let them enjoy the process of reading and learning as well, people do pick up even heavy books. It's just, I suppose luck plays a role, but I'm not completely sold on the idea that, people turn away instinctively from heavy-ish books, because I think we can trust our young people a little bit more. I think we need to make an effort, but I think they'll also meet us halfway. We don't need to go all out for them. We don't need to go all out and make it ultra simple. Of course, people will make efforts. There are people who do YouTube videos and that kind of thing. But even the reading audience, I think with the slightest of effort, we find that there are readers out there and there is reason to be hopeful.
The BJP specifically has appropriated Ambedkar, Gandhi up to a point. Bhagat Singh was a leftist and an atheist, and are going around trying to also somehow link with all kinds of iconic figures to show that it too has a past, and it follows that legacy and those messages. Meanwhile, continuing to do its own thing, which would have offended all three of them. This kind of thing, obviously they'll find people all over the country. Do you think it's a strategy that will have a payoff?
I think so. The thing is, political parties also need to constantly construct legitimacy. There's a constant need to construct a history for yourself, so that it's not just the here and now. You're also putting out some kind of an ideology, some kind of a message. And ideologies generally do need ancestors. They do need people who are appealing, people who are interesting, people who are known to be towering figures. Even this whole battle on kings, and you mentioned Shivaji, for example, and how exactly to read Shivaji, who wants to appropriate Shivaji and who won't let them appropriate it. All of this is about constructing a kind of pedigree. It's all about constructing a kind of legitimacy for a political ideology. Which is also why you often find that ultra right-wing groups in all countries, not just in India, they tend not to like historians and writers and people like that who sometimes throw spanners in the works. They don't necessarily buy into these ideologies and this constructed pedigree. That kind of appropriation of historical figures, to me, is natural. Political parties will do it. With the BJP, we're seeing it now because they've been in power for a good stretch now and in a way that has never been seen before. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of conscious construction of their own legitimacy, their own past, sort of reframing their role and their meaning in the larger story of India. All of that is going to happen. But again, there are ways to counter it. Simple as, good research. Good research counters all kinds of political ideologies, all kinds of political shortcuts that are taken. And a larger conversation around these things in the public also counters it. Right now, perhaps because people don't know what exactly and entirely a Sardar Patel stood for, it's easier for the party to try and completely own him. It's also partly true that, his own party perhaps did not pay him due regard, which made it easier for somebody else to come and appropriate him. So there are multiple things at play here, but broadly, yes, I think this is part of that general tendency that any political power, anybody who's in a position of power, no matter how powerful and seemingly inassailable, there's always that conscious need to build legitimacy and to build a narrative around it that reinforces their power, not just in hard power, but also by giving it that force of ideology, by giving it pedigree, by giving it some kind of a history. That is why history is a battlefield, because people see that they can mine it for their own current reasons, for various forms of power, for various ideologies, and that's going to be the case always. I don't think we're just seeing it with the BJP in a new style, but they know they wouldn't be the first to do it, and they won't be the last.
After the Mapla Rebellion, and Tipu Sultan, specifically in Kerala and other neighboring states, what is a possible next target for revisiting it, shall we say, euphemistically?
Considering that they haven't exhausted these targets yet, I don't think new targets will be needed anytime soon. There's a Mapla leader called Varyam Kunnath who was in the news last year in Kerala because somebody decided to make a movie on him, and obviously people were up in arms saying, he was not a freedom fighter, you can't make a movie on him, etc., etc. Now, of course, anybody can make a movie on anything they want. Ultimately, that's their choice. But yeah, there'll always be figures they can pull up this way. I don't think they've exhausted Tipu Sultan or the Maplas. So I think for now in Kerala and Karnataka, they're set. We'll see who in future they pick up to sort of, hammer into the wall and then nail them there and say, okay, this is our villain for the season. There will be new ones. There's no doubt about that. But, once we sort of accept that this is the strategy, then we can sort of get down to actually figuring out how to sort of counter it in the long run. I think merely outraging on an instance-to-instance basis is ultimately counterproductive because that feeds into that whole thing. I think sometimes we need to keep a cool head, realize, look, this is the broad tendency, this is the broad trend we are seeing. How are we going to address the trend rather than incidents and specific moments in that larger trend? I think we have to be a little more creative in that respect. On social media, sometimes in the outrage, we forget the larger picture and we forget that we need to come up with a larger strategy. I'm hoping that, books that are readable, etc., is one way to counter it, but people must come up with other ways also. And one has to think outside the box. One has to get creative. They're upsetting the rules of the game. You assume there will be certain rules of the game. Now the rules themselves are being changed. The playing field is no longer even. It's sort of tilted in somebody's favor, which means one has to think outside the box and get creative about how these things are countered. And that's, as I said, it's a long-term game. I don't think anything is going to be resolved in a year or two. We really do have to pull up our socks and think, look, if you really care about another idea of India, if you really care about another kind of future, then we really have to fight a long battle, not something that will be resolved immediately or in a day or a year from now. It's really a long-term strategy that needs to be developed.
Yeah, well, on that note, I completely agree with you, and it's going to be a lot of rigor and hard work to come up with counter narratives, because what we assumed were established narratives are being challenged. So now you need a counter. And let us hope other historians, other researchers, perhaps even other political figures come up with cogent arguments and try and counter this. Because if it's a battlefield, there have to be other soldiers and the other side. So let's hope that happens. I honestly think that those with real conviction in their beliefs are not going to get shaken so easily. I'll give you the example of the Bhima Koregaon, which some Hindutva forces try to disturb. And try as you will, that argument is never going to get traction, because people know that there are large number of Dalits as well as other secular forces who believe in the meaning of what Bhima Koregaon was. Let's not forget, there was Ambedkar also involved in that. So you at the one hand, if you're trying to say Ambedkar, we appreciate him, and on the other, you kind of demolish anything to do with Dalit history, that's not going to work beyond a point. So Manu Pillai, I'm glad you spoke out at a podcast, because these things reach many more people. And thank you very much for joining us at this and explaining it so cogently and in such minute detail.
Thanks, Siddharth. Pleasure to be here.
That was Manu Pillai, author and historian, explaining what the attempts to challenge existing history, in this particular case, the Mapla Rebellion of 1921 in Kerala. And next week, we'll be back with another guest. Till then, it's goodbye from the Wire Talks team. See you next week.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Priya Mirza, host of our new podcast, The Longest Constitution, talks to Cyrus about her show and her podcasting experience. The importance of investing in a good night's sleep is highlighted by founder and CEO of Sleepy Cat, Kabir Siddique, on Advertising is Dead with Varun. On the Wire Talks, Siddharth talks about the horrendous capture of Kabul by the Taliban with the author and journalist Taran Khan. Co-founders of the Goa Rainbow Trust, Francis and Chris Fernandez, joined Farhad and Sunetra on GabyCD. Witness the epic battles between detergent brands HUL and Nirma, as narrated by Anupam and Ambi on The Last Brand Standing. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you enjoyed this show or any of our shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word about a podcast. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Ciet Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Intuit India. We really do appreciate the support. You are what makes this possible.
Season 3 of Echoes of India, your favorite history podcast, is back on the IVM Podcast Network. I'm your host, Anirudh Kanasetti. Join me on a journey through the wonders of early India as we explore the centuries between Buddha and Ashoka with critical research, empathy, and great storytelling. Along the way, you'll hear from all the vibrant peoples who shaped our world, from monks and farmers to warriors and emperors. New episodes are out every Monday.